Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to RealFear Files. Today I am sharing 9 deeply disquieting tales emerging from the overlooked regions of Pennsylvania, where quiet towns often hide their most haunting secrets. In this episode, we will travel through the dim corners of communities where the past refuses to stay silent and the unexplained becomes unsettlingly vivid. These 9 accounts have been carefully assembled from archived reports, recorded testimonies, and regional documents that stretch across decades of Pennsylvania's shadowed history. Each story reflects the genuine experiences of people who encountered something that fractured their sense of comfort in places they once believed were safe. To honor the privacy and well-being of those who offered their accounts, certain names, particular towns, and identifying elements have been thoughtfully modified, while preserving the essential reality of what occurred. If you are joining us for the first time, be sure to subscribe to RealFear Files for daily true horror stories designed to keep you alert long after the lights go out. Activate the notification bell so you never miss when the darkness stirs and calls. Story 1. Damon had been grinding through the late shift at the Fuel and Go off Highway 74 for just over 3 years when he first felt something was off. The station sat right on the edge of a washed-up mining town in western Pennsylvania, one of those blink-and-you-miss-it places nobody talks about unless they have to. Ever since the coal industry tanked back in the 80s, the whole area had been fading like an old photograph. The town barely had an identity. A stretch of tired houses, a post office that shut down before lunchtime, and a handful of mom-and-pop shops trying to survive one slow day at a time. Most nights at the Fuel and Go crawled by quietly, interrupted only by a long-haul trucker desperate for caffeine or some local dragging in to buy smokes before heading home. Damon didn't mind the loneliness. In fact, he kind of liked it. It gave him time to chip away at his online college classes, his escape plan, the thing he hoped would eventually carry him out of this sinking town. There was one regular he could always count on. Name was Harold, mid-50s, graying hair, hands permanently darkened by decades spent in the mines before they shut down. He was one of the few people who still carried the weight of this town in his eyes. Harold rolled in almost every night at around 11, grabbing the same things like clockwork: a pack of Reds, a scratch-off ticket, and a cup of black coffee that tasted like asphalt, but he never complained. They'd chat a bit, weather, Steelers talk, how the whole town felt like it was slowly erasing itself. Nothing deep, but enough to make Damon feel like he wasn't completely alone at 2 a.m. Then one night, Harold didn't show. At first, Damon shrugged it off. Folks changed their routines. Maybe Harold found a new store or finally kicked the cigarette habit. But after a full week passed with 0 Harold sightings, something inside Damon started itching. It wasn't just that Harold was gone. It was the weird indifference from everyone else. A few regulars Damon asked about him just shrugged, said they hadn't seen him around. One woman looked at Damon like he'd just asked her to donate a kidney, completely thrown off that he even brought it up. Weeks rolled by, and that uneasy feeling only grew heavier. Damon finally called the town's non-emergency line, wanting to at least flag Harold as missing. The dispatcher sounded irritated, like he was wasting her time. She told him adults were allowed to disappear if they wanted to, and unless someone had proof of foul play, there wasn't anything they could do. Damon hung up feeling helpless. Sure, the police were short-staffed and overloaded, but brushing him off like that burned. It was on a cold Thursday night in late October when Damon finally decided he couldn't just sit on it anymore. His shift ended at 2 a.m., and instead of driving home like usual, he found himself pointing his car toward the old part of town where Harold lived. Damon had been to the house once before, just long enough to return a wallet Harold had forgotten on the counter. The place was a tiny, single-story house with peeling paint, a porch sinking into itself, and a yard that backed up to a long abandoned mine entrance. The mine had been fenced off ages ago, but everyone knew the chain-link barrier was basically a suggestion. People slipped in now and then for stupid dares or shady reasons no one asked about. Pulling up, Damon saw newspapers piled on Harold's porch. Way too many for someone who was home. The windows were dark, the whole house still and heavy. Damon knocked a few times, starting soft, then louder. No answer. The front door was locked. Circling around to the back, he cupped his hands against the kitchen window. Everything looked untouched, but the thin layer of dust on the table told him nobody had been inside for a while. His heart started thudding. Something was definitely wrong. Then he saw it, the faintest hint of a trail behind the house. Just a thin line of trampled grass leading toward the old mine entrance. Damon hesitated for several long seconds before pulling out his phone and flicking the flashlight on. The beam cut through the dark as he followed the trail. The closer he got to the mine, the more every instinct screamed, "Turn around, man, don't do this." But he kept going, driven by this gnawing sense of responsibility and the dread of what he might find. The mine entrance looked like the mouth of something ancient and hungry. Just a huge black void surrounded by rusted, unreadable warning signs. Damon pushed through a hole in the fence and stood at the threshold, shining his light inside. The air seeping out was icy and damp, carrying a sour smell of dirt and something far worse. He almost turned back. Then his light hit something. A boot. Worn, muddy, unmistakably Harold's. Damon stepped inside. The tunnel was narrow, low, forcing him to hunch as he moved forward. Moisture clung to the walls, and the floor was uneven, scattered with debris from decades of abandonment. Dripping water echoed from somewhere deep in the dark, each drop sounding like a slow, ticking clock. His phone battery ticked downward as he followed the tunnel. Just when he was about to give up and turn around, his light caught something else. A second shoe. Then a torn scrap of fabric snagged on a shard of rock. His breathing went thin, shallow, panic tightening around him. Still, he pushed forward. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, and Damon froze. Bodies. Not one, several. Some were just skeletons. Others, not so old. And slumped against the far wall, unmistakable even in death, was Harold. A bullet hole marked the side of his head. The world spun. Damon didn't remember running. Didn't remember the drive back to the gas station. Didn't remember punching in the numbers to call the cops. He just remembered the horror. The realization that something monstrous had been happening right here in this forgotten town. And no one had noticed. When the police finally rolled up to the fuel and go, Damon was still shaking so hard he could barely hold his phone. The officers treated him like he was half delusional, asking him the same questions over and over, like they expected him to suddenly admit he made everything up. But Damon wouldn't budge. He forced them to follow him back to the mine, leading the way even though every step made his stomach twist. When the cops went inside with their own heavy-duty lights and gear, they found exactly what he'd described. The chamber. The bodies. The sickening truth that had been hiding right under their noses. After that, everything exploded into chaos. State police took over. The mine got sealed off with caution tape and armed patrols. Forensic techs crawled over every inch of that underground chamber for weeks, collecting bones, analyzing soil, pulling out anything that might tell them who had been using the mine like their personal hunting ground. Reports started trickling in that Harold wasn't the only one who had disappeared. Over the last 15 years, at least 8 men, most of them older, living alone, ex-miners, had vanished without a trace. Now they had their bodies. But the worst discovery wasn't the victims. It was what the police found deeper inside the tunnels. Past the chamber, in a more hidden section of the mine, investigators uncovered a makeshift living area. like someone had been camping out there long term. There were tools, blankets, canned food, and notebooks filled with pages of writing. Not journals, not confessions, more like surveillance logs. Names, schedules, observations, notes about routines and habits of the same men who had gone missing. Whoever wrote them planned everything, watched these men for weeks or months before taking them. Obsessed, calculated, cold. And while some cops told Damon he'd done the right thing by discovering it all, he still sensed a simmering frustration toward him. Some detectives hinted that by stumbling into the crime scene, he'd potentially contaminated evidence. Damon didn't care. He had done something no one else had. He'd refused to ignore what didn't feel right. But as months passed, it became painfully obvious that the investigation wasn't going anywhere. The notebooks had no identifying information. The campsite had no prints that matched anything in databases. No DNA, no witnesses, no leads with teeth. It was like the killer had lived in the shadows their entire life, leaving nothing behind but devastation. And the lack of answers burrowed deep into Damon's mind. He thought constantly about Harold, about how he'd come into the store every night while someone out there watched him like prey. Damon began replaying every single conversation they'd ever had, searching for some clue he'd missed. Ever since he discovered that underground hell, Damon had been sleeping terribly. His dreams turned into claustrophobic nightmares, always the same. Trapped in a dark tunnel, surrounded by silent bodies, unable to find the exit. He considered quitting his job more than once. Every time he pulled into the parking lot, the neon lights gave him a hollow feeling. But somewhere inside him, he felt like leaving would be abandoning Harold and the others. The store was where their lives had brushed against his. It felt wrong to walk away. 6 months later, everything changed. It was a slow Tuesday night, just like any other. Damon was zoning out behind the counter when a man he had never seen before walked through the door. Tall, skinny, pale, like he hadn't been outside in years. His eyes were dark and heavy, and they fixed on Damon with this strange, lingering intensity that made Damon's skin crawl. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't even pretend to look at the aisles. He just grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of chips before approaching the counter. Damon rang up the items, forcing himself to keep his voice steady even though every nerve in his body was screaming. When the man slid a few crumpled bills across the counter, he finally smiled. A slow, deliberate, razor-thin smile. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then he walked out into the night. For a full minute, Damon couldn't move. Something about that man, something deep, instinctual, felt wrong. Like every alarm bell in his brain had gone off at the same time. It was the same gut feeling he'd had about Harold. Shaking, Damon pulled up the security footage and zoomed in on the man's face. He saved the clip and fired it off to the lead detective on the mine case. The detective called the next day. They were looking into it. But there was no credit card trail. The man had paid in cash. And the license plate on his car was smeared with mud, impossible to read. No way to track him. Damon felt panic coil in his gut. He couldn't explain why, but he knew that man was connected. Maybe the one who had been hiding in the mine. Maybe the one who killed Harold. Maybe the one who kept coming back to the edges of town like it belonged to him. For the next few weeks, Damon watched every person who came into the store like they might be the monster. He started keeping a notebook of his own, writing down times, descriptions, purchases. He knew it was obsessive, but the fear wouldn't let him stop. Every night felt like sitting in a glass box while something hunted outside. He stopped going out after work, stopped hanging out with friends, stopped doing anything except working, studying, and watching the door. He lived in a constant state of dread, convinced the killer was still out there, still close, waiting. The case remains unsolved. The police chased dozens of leads, interviewed whole neighborhoods, reanalyzed every scrap of evidence from the mine. Nothing stuck. No arrests were ever made. The mine entrance was eventually filled with concrete. Families were given back the remains of their loved ones. The town pretended things were normal again. But Damon knew better. Before long, he finished his degree and left the town behind. He needed distance, needed air that wasn't heavy with things left unsaid. Still, even years later, he finds himself thinking about Harold and the others, wondering if he could have helped sooner, wondering if he could have saved someone. And he thinks about that man, the one who walked into the store with that chilling, knowing smile. The smile that seemed like a message, a warning, or a promise. Some evils never get caught. They just find a darker corner to hide in. And wait. Story 2. Marissa had grown up on the same stretch of farmland in rural Pennsylvania her whole life. A wide-open property tucked just a few miles from the edge of the Allegheny National Forest. Her family had owned it for generations, 4 to be exact, passed down from her great-grandfather, who'd cleared the fields and built the original barn himself back in the Roaring '20s. Life on the farm had shaped her. The crack of dawn feedings, the endless rotation of planting and harvesting, and the quiet that came from being miles away from any real hustle. She knew every nook and cranny of the land, every stand of trees, every twist in the creeks, every shadow that slid across the fields as the sun rose and fell. Or at least, she thought she did. It was a late October night, that kind of crisp autumn air that smelled like bonfires and fallen leaves. Marissa had been covering a late shift at the vet clinic in town. One of the techs had called out sick. By the time she closed up, the clock was pushing midnight. The roads out to her farm were narrow and twisty, threading through thick forest so dense that even mid-afternoon sunlight barely touched the ground. At night, it was pitch black. Only her headlights cut through it, occasionally catching a pair of glowing eyes, deer, raccoons, darting across her path. She'd driven these roads 1,000 times, and she knew better than to rush, especially in hunting season when wildlife could get downright unpredictable. Foot eased on the gas, eyes scanning. About 3 miles from the house, something darted across the gravel right in front of her. She slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before stopping. Heart hammering, adrenaline spiking, she braced for a deer to bolt into the trees. But there was nothing. Just the empty road, nothing but darkness pressing in from all sides. Marissa gripped the wheel for a long beat, trying to settle her breath. "Probably just a deer," she muttered, willing her pulse to slow. Maybe her eyes were tricking her, making something small look big. But the movement didn't sit right. Those strides had been too long, too fast, too purposeful. She shook her head, forcing the thought away, and pressed on. Home. Check the animals. Sleep. Pulling into the driveway, everything looked normal. Porch light on, warm glow spilling across the front steps. The barn stood in the distance, a dark silhouette against a sky full of stars. She parked, grabbed a flashlight, and went to check the animals. 6 cows, a handful of chickens, 2 horses, creatures she'd grown up with, as familiar as family. She pushed open the barn door, flicked on the light, and immediately felt it. Wrong. The horses were tense, ears pinned back, wide-eyed. The cows huddled in the far corner, breathing fast. Calm, familiar animals now seemed terrified. Marissa moved quickly, checking each one, searching for injuries. Nothing. Physically, they were fine. Whatever had scared them, she couldn't see it. She spent nearly an hour in the barn, speaking in low, soothing tones, rubbing flanks, running hands over soft coats. Eventually, the animals' breathing slowed, and they began to settle. She bolted the barn door tight and headed back inside, but that pit-of-the-stomach dread didn't fade. Morning came with the familiar crow of the rooster. Normally comforting, grounding. But when Marissa stepped outside to feed the chickens, she froze. Prints in the mud. Big ones. Deep. With sharp claw marks at the tips. Not deer. Not bear. Too narrow to be a coyote or dog, yet massive. Each print about the size of her hand, sunk into the soft ground like something heavy had stepped there. Crouching, she traced the trail. From the tree line at the edge of her property, across the yard, straight to the barn. The tracks circled the building, pacing, as if testing doors, looking for a way in. At the back corner, by the weathered wood, she spotted deep scratches gouged into the siding. Long, parallel grooves, claw marks larger than anything she'd seen before. Pulling out her phone, she snapped pictures and called her neighbor Hank, a retired game warden who'd lived in the area longer than anyone. When he arrived, he studied the prints quietly, then finally looked at her with a grim expression. He admitted he'd seen similar tracks years ago while on the job. Most folks shrugged them off as bears or misidentified wolves, but Hank always suspected otherwise. He wouldn't name it, didn't want to guess, but he told her to keep the animals locked up at night and to avoid being outside alone after dark. His tone chilled her. Hank wasn't easily scared. If he was serious, this wasn't a joke. Over the next few weeks, Marissa became obsessive. Motion sensor lights went up around the barn and house. A rifle was at her side any time she stepped outside after sunset. She didn't see the creature again, but she knew it was out there. Lights would flash in the dead of night, but peering out the windows revealed nothing. Empty fields. Dark tree lines. Her animals stayed skittish, especially at night, and she lost sleep, lying awake, listening for the slightest rustle that might hint the thing had returned. Then came early November. She stepped out to the barn and found one of her cows dead, about 50 yards out in the pasture. The body had been ripped open brutally, chunks of flesh missing. Not a clean predator kill, more violent, chaotic. The ground was churned, marked with those enormous prints from weeks ago. Marissa called the wildlife officer. He measured, sampled, photographed, and told her it was likely a bear, citing recent bear movements due to drought. But she could tell he didn't really buy it. The bite marks, the way the flesh was torn, it didn't fit a bear. He repeated Hank's advice. Keep everything locked, stay inside, call if anything else happened. But unusual had already become the new normal. Weeks later, she lost 2 more cows, the same savage pattern. Some nights she slept in the barn, rifle across her lap, hoping to see the predator herself. She set up trail cameras along the tree line, desperate to prove her suspicions. Something unnatural lived in those woods, something that didn't belong to any category she knew. Around 3 in the morning, Marissa jolted awake to the most bone-chilling sound she'd ever heard. The horses in the barn were screaming, high-pitched, panicked, a sound that sliced through the cold November air like a knife. She shot upright, heart hammering, and grabbed her rifle. Her breath came out in white puffs, fogging in front of her face as she ran outside. The motion sensor lights flared on, painting the yard in harsh, unnatural white. And there it was, standing at the edge of her property, just past the fence line, a creature unlike anything she'd ever seen. Easily 7 feet tall, upright on 2 legs, with a body that was a terrifying blend of human and canine. Its fur was dark and matted, its head wolf-like, with a long snout and pointed ears. But its eyes, those glowing yellow-green eyes, froze her in place. They stared straight through her, intelligent and calculating. The creature didn't move. It didn't growl. It just watched, as if weighing her like a piece of meat, deciding whether she was prey or a threat. Marissa raised the rifle, hands shaking so badly the barrel wobbled. She wanted to shoot, to protect her land, her animals, but she couldn't. Something primal held her back. Maybe fear, maybe disbelief, maybe sheer awe at what she was seeing. For what felt like an eternity, they stayed locked in a silent standoff. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature pivoted and loped into the forest. It moved with a fluid, almost supernatural grace. No human, no animal should move like that. Marissa didn't sleep the rest of the night. She sat on the porch, rifle across her knees, waiting for the sun. When the first light broke over the horizon, she went back to the spot where the creature had stood. More prints. The same massive clawed tracks that had haunted her property for weeks. And something else. Tufts of coarse, dark fur snagged on the barbed wire fence, thicker and rougher than anything she'd ever felt. She bagged the fur and retrieved the trail camera photos. Taking them to a wildlife biologist at the state university, she hoped for answers. The biologist examined the evidence meticulously, running tests on the fur and analyzing the images. When he called her back, his voice was cautious, almost apologetic. "The fur doesn't match any known canid species in North America," he said. "Its structure is unusual. And the photos, although blurry, show something large, bipedal, moving through the forest. I can't explain it." He suggested she contact a cryptozoologist, someone who studied unexplained creatures. But Marissa didn't need a stranger to tell her what she'd seen. She already knew. She felt it in her bones, in the way her animals reacted, in the fear that clung to the farm like a thick fog. Over the next year, the losses continued. Livestock disappeared or were found mutilated in the same grotesque fashion. Cameras, lights, fences, nothing stopped it. The creature came and went as it pleased. Eventually, Marissa stopped talking about it. People in town already thought she was a little paranoid. When she mentioned the creature, she was met with disbelief or mockery. So she kept it to herself. But she learned to live with it. She learned to walk in fear's shadow, to accept that some things in this world defied explanation. That some things existed in the spaces between what we know and what we refuse to believe. Her routines didn't change much on the surface. She still fed the animals, still walked the same fields her great-grandfather had cleared nearly a century ago. But she never went outside after dark without the rifle in hand. And she never forgot the sight of the creature, standing at the edge of the property, watching her with those glowing, intelligent eyes. She knew it was still out there somewhere, lurking in the forest. Waiting. Some nights, she would sit on the porch, scanning the tree line with binoculars, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. Every rustle, every snapping twig made her flinch. She slept lightly, dreams haunted by those yellow-green eyes. Sometimes she imagined it watching her from just beyond the tree line, studying her, always observing, always patient. Marissa began to notice other odd things, too. Sounds that didn't belong, low growls that carried on the wind, shadows flitting between trees that didn't match any normal animal. Her dogs refused to go near the tree line at dusk, ears flat, hackles up. Even the cows, once fearless, shied away from certain patches of the pasture. She kept meticulous records. Times of attacks, locations of prints, camera footage, animal behavior. It became her obsession, her way of coping. The farm was no longer just a home. It was a battleground, a place where she and her unseen adversary were engaged in a slow, ongoing game of survival. Years passed. Marissa adapted. She learned the rhythms of the creature's visits, its preferred haunts, its patterns. She reinforced fences, installed more lights, moved animals closer to the house at night. It wasn't perfect, but it gave her some control, a thin shield between her and the unknown predator. People continued to doubt her, dismiss her as overly cautious, maybe even crazy. She let them talk. Marissa had stopped needing validation. She had seen it, felt it, lived it. And some nights, she swore she could sense it watching from the shadows, almost like it was waiting for her to slip up. Even now, years later, she walks her fields with caution, rifle in hand, eyes scanning. The barn stands strong, the animals accounted for. But she never forgets. That moment in the dead of night when the world felt too still, and the forest itself seemed alive with a presence she could not name. She knows it still prowls the dark, patient, waiting. And deep down, she knows that one night, it might step out of the trees and come back. Story 3. Evan had never imagined he'd inherit anything from his grandma. They weren't exactly close, not out of any real tension, just the miles and years that had drifted between them. She had spent her adult life in a tiny coal town in Schuylkill County, a place where the calendar seemed stuck in the 1950s, and the population had been bleeding out ever since the mines closed decades ago. When she passed at 93, Evan was shocked to find that she'd left him her old house, a narrow, two-story relic built in the late 1800s, squatting on a quiet street with other aging homes. It looked smaller than he remembered, paint flaking and the front porch sagging like it was ready to collapse. Most of the neighbors' houses were empty, dark windows staring like forgotten eyes. Stepping onto the street felt like entering a town abandoned by time itself. He pulled the key from his pocket and opened the front door. Inside, the air was thick and stale, dust motes dancing in the faint afternoon sunlight slipping through the curtains. Sheets covered most of the furniture, giving the rooms a ghostly, untouched look. Evan moved slowly, checking what would need fixing before he could even think about selling it. The kitchen was old but usable. The living room was cluttered with decades-old magazines and newspapers. Upstairs, the bedrooms were packed with boxes of his grandmother's life, the kind of stuff that takes years to sort. But it wasn't until he reached the basement that things took a strange turn. He had nearly skipped it, assuming it was just another storage pit full of junk. But curiosity got the better of him. He climbed the creaky wooden steps and pulled the chain to light a single bare bulb, casting a weak yellow glow. The basement was rough. Concrete walls, some sections of dirt floor, and a scent of mildew that made him wrinkle his nose. Old furniture and stacked boxes lined the walls, creating narrow pathways. Then Evan noticed something off. One corner of the basement wall looked different. The concrete was slightly lighter, like a patch or repair. He ran his hand across it, feeling the texture change. He pushed, and a section shifted. A hidden panel. Behind it was a narrow doorway swallowed by darkness. Shining his phone flashlight inside, Evan saw a small room, barely 10 feet square. Wooden shelves lined the walls, crammed with curious objects. Leather-bound journals, jars filled with dried herbs and strange powders, photographs, newspaper clippings, and odd artifacts he couldn't place. In the center sat a small wooden table, and on it was a journal open to a page in his grandmother's handwriting. His hands trembled as he stepped in and picked it up. The page was dated March 15th, 1942, over 80 years ago. As he read, His stomach turned. She had written about bizarre experiences in the house, moments when time slipped, when she woke in rooms she didn't remember entering, or saw people who weren't there. Objects vanished and reappeared. Voices from the past whispered in empty rooms, and shadows moved in impossible ways. The most chilling part? A list of names at the bottom of the page. 5 names, neatly written. 3 were people from town who'd gone missing, cold cases never solved. The other 2 were unfamiliar, but seeing them in her script sent a shiver down his spine. And at the bottom, in slightly different ink, was his own name. Evan Mitchell, with today's date, March 16th, 2025. He dropped the journal, heart racing. How could this be? She had written this decades before he was even born. There was no rational explanation for knowing he'd be here, in this hidden room, on this exact day. Shaking, Evan picked it up again and flipped through more pages. Each entry chronicled events defying the rules of time and space. His grandmother had meticulously logged dates, locations, even minor details of each strange event. She had discovered this hidden room soon after moving in around 1948 and found journals from previous owners describing the same oddities. Time, it seemed, had never flowed normally in this house. Each resident experienced distortions, slipping into past or future, vanishing, reappearing. Evan read accounts of people disappearing without trace, only to be glimpsed wandering confused through the house, then vanishing again. Others were found days later with no memory of where they'd been. As he pored over decades of records, a terrifying realization struck him. The house had been a temporal anomaly for generations. Each resident had documented its effects, creating a layered record spanning over a century. Photographs showed people in clothing from different eras, standing in rooms that existed across decades. Newspaper clippings chronicled missing persons, often written off as runaways or unsolved mysteries. Strange artifacts littered the room, a pocket watch frozen at 3:47, which ticked backward in his hands, a mirror reflecting images that weren't present, fragments of letters in languages he couldn't read. Hours passed like minutes. The sun began to dip, and Evan gathered several journals to read under better light upstairs. But as he climbed, he froze. Footsteps echoed from the upper floor. Slow, deliberate. Someone was moving through the house. The front door was still locked. No one had entered. Heart hammering, Evan crept upstairs. The footsteps stopped, but he sensed a presence he couldn't explain. He checked each room. Empty. He convinced himself it was just the old house settling, or nerves fraying from the journals. Then he heard them again. Footsteps coming from below. He peered down the staircase. Nothing. Yet the sound continued through the living room, into the kitchen, halting at the basement door. Descending slowly, fists clenched, he found fresh footprints in the dust. Small, narrow, not his own, leading straight to the hidden room. The journal he'd dropped was now open to a new page, written in his grandmother's hand, dated today. March 16th, 2025. The entry was brief. Evan came today, just as I knew he would. He found the room. He doesn't understand yet, but he will. Time is not what he thinks. The house remembers. The house always remembers. Evan's mind spun. His grandmother had been dead for weeks, yet the house, somehow, had recorded him. He bolted upstairs, slamming the basement door behind him, and fled in his car, journals stacked beside him. Back in his city apartment, Evan sat on the edge of his couch, the journals spread around him like a chaotic map of the impossible. For days, he couldn't bring himself to read them all. But eventually, curiosity clawed its way past fear. He picked up one journal after another, scanning the meticulous entries for patterns. It became clear almost immediately. The house had a history that went far beyond his grandmother's lifetime. Built in 1887, it had been erected on land once sacred to the local Native American tribes. The original owner had experienced strange events almost immediately. Rooms shifting, clocks reversing, shadows moving independently. Each subsequent inhabitant had written down their experiences, unaware that the house itself seemed to be chronicling their lives across decades. There was a pattern tied to one specific date, March 16th. Every year, temporal disturbances spiked. People disappeared. Objects moved on their own. Shadows appeared where they shouldn't. Time bent in ways that were impossible to understand. Evan realized with a cold certainty that his grandmother had known this. She had known he'd inherit the house, find the hidden room, and confront the truth on this exact date. Sleep became impossible. He dreamed of the house, its hallways stretching endlessly, rooms folding into one another. In these dreams, he could hear his grandmother's voice echoing. Time is not linear. The past, present, and future exist all at once. You are already part of it. Evan tried to sell the house, hoping distance might save him. Every potential buyer backed out, some with vague excuses, others vanishing without explanation. Contractors refused to touch it. It was as though the house itself refused to be altered or destroyed, protecting its secrets and trapping those who came near. He attempted to seal the basement door with concrete, thinking that would contain the strange power. But deep down, he knew it was futile. The house didn't obey rules. The house had its own memory, its own will. Days blurred into nights. Evan began noticing anomalies in his apartment. Objects out of place, shadows moving against the grain of reality, clocks ticking backward. Every reflection felt wrong. He could swear he glimpsed people in the corners of his vision, faces he didn't recognize, yet somehow familiar. The journals claimed this was possible. The house could project its influence beyond its walls, bending time for anyone connected to it. Finally, he realized there was no escaping. He was part of the cycle now, tied to the house and its memory. He returned reluctantly, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. Walking up the cracked walkway, the house loomed like a sentinel. Its windows reflected the setting sun, but something about them felt alive, as if the house itself was watching him. Inside, he moved cautiously, checking each room. The hidden panel in the basement called to him. He descended, heart pounding, and switched on the light. The shelves were exactly as they had been. The journals waited, open to pages that seemed to shift as he read. The latest entry was dated today, March 16, 2025. His grandmother's handwriting spelled out words he didn't remember reading before. Evan, the house has chosen you. It remembers everything. You are its heir, bound to the memory of every soul who has come before. Watch, listen, record. Time folds for you now. Evan's hands shook. The air felt charged, alive, like the house was breathing around him. Shadows danced unnaturally in the corners of the basement. The journals whispered, though no one else was there. He understood now. He couldn't escape. Every choice he made, every step, was already recorded in the house's timeline. He tried to rationalize it, tried to convince himself it was hallucination or stress. But the evidence was undeniable. The journals documented hundreds of years of similar experiences. People vanished, appeared, lived moments they couldn't explain, always returning to March 16 in some form. He had seen it himself. The house had predicted him. Over the next weeks, Evan adjusted to a new rhythm of life. He documented everything meticulously, replicating the work of his grandmother and the house's previous tenants. He marked the time, the rooms, the anomalies. Objects moved. Sounds echoed where no one stood. Shadows flickered in ways that defied logic. But for the first time, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He realized the house wasn't just a trap. It was a guardian of history, a recorder of reality itself. It remembered every event, every person, every moment that passed through it. And now he was part of that memory, a node in its web, bound to the house across time. As years passed, Evan learned to navigate the strange effects. He noticed subtle changes in the environment. Rooms folding, clocks reversing, glimpses of people from decades past walking through walls. He left messages in journals for future residents, just as others had before him, documenting anomalies and giving warnings. The cycle continued, each occupant adding to the chain of recorded time. Even with his understanding, fear never fully left him. The house was unpredictable. Shadows moved on their own, sometimes with intention, sometimes seemingly random. Objects vanished and reappeared. Every March 16th brought heightened disturbances. Evan marked the date carefully, always vigilant, always aware that he could vanish as others had. He never saw anyone again in the hidden room, except through reflections in mirrors or fleeting glimpses in shadows. The house had made him a keeper of its secrets, bound to protect them, to live within its folds. He learned not to fight, not to resist. The house had always remembered, always waited, and now he understood his role: witness, chronicler, participant. And so Evan continued his life, tethered to the house. He could leave, technically, but the house followed. It projected itself into his dreams, into reflections, into reality. The journals were never far from his side. Every March 16th he prepared, reading notes from decades past and recording new observations for those yet to come. He lived with the knowledge that one day he might disappear. Not because of danger, not because of violence, but because the house demanded it. Because time was not linear, and he was already recorded in its memory. It was not fear that kept him going, it was understanding. He was part of something larger than himself, a participant in a continuum of strange, impossible events stretching back centuries. To this day, Evan Mitchell owns the house in Schuylkill County. He doesn't often enter it alone, but he cannot stay away entirely. He dreams of it every night, hallways stretching infinitely, rooms folding into one another, shadows moving across walls. His grandmother's voice whispers in the echoes, reminding him, "Time is not what you think. The house remembers. The house always remembers." And each March 16th, he wonders if the next one will be his last, wondering if he, like the others before him, will be absorbed fully into the memory of the house, becoming another story, another journal, another whisper in its endless timeline. Story 4. Cassie Harper had always been fascinated by history, especially the kind you could touch, walk through, and feel under your hands. So when she stumbled across a colonial-era house for sale in a quiet town just 15 miles outside Gettysburg, she felt like it was destiny. This house had been standing since 1847, just a dozen years shy of the Civil War, and its worn walls had silently witnessed history unfold around them. The realtor was up front. The place needed a lot of work. The plumbing was ancient, the roof had seen better decades, and the interior hadn't been touched since the 1970s. But Cassie didn't care. She saw the charm hiding under the dust and peeling paint, the original hardwood floors, the intricately carved fireplace mantel, the solid stone foundation that had resisted time for nearly 200 years. She made an offer that very day, fueled by a mix of excitement and intuition. Moving in was a slow grind. Cassie lived over an hour away, so she could only work on the house during weekends. She carried boxes of her belongings piece by piece, gradually turning empty rooms into something resembling a home. The first few stays were quiet and uneventful, cleaning, painting, arranging furniture. Nothing out of the ordinary. But on her fourth overnight visit, the ordinary gave way to something else entirely. She woke suddenly in the middle of the night, heart racing, to the sound of footsteps. Not the typical creaks of settling floorboards, but deliberate, measured steps that moved with intention across the hallway above her bedroom. She froze, listening, barely breathing. The footsteps traveled the length of the hallway, then stopped. Cassie told herself it was nothing. Old houses made weird noises, but the unease coiled tightly in her stomach like a living thing. The following night it happened again. Only this time, the footsteps were joined by other sounds. There was the faint metallic clink of chains or buckles, and the low murmur of voices, just far enough away to be indecipherable. Cassie climbed out of bed and crept to the bottom of the stairs, staring into the dark upper floor. The noises seemed to be coming from the master bedroom, the room she hadn't even furnished yet. Heart thudding, she ascended the stairs slowly, fingers trailing along the railing, and gently pushed open the door. The room was empty, bare floors, blank walls. But the air was heavy, charged in a way she couldn't explain. She lingered in the doorway, scanning the shadows, but the sounds had vanished. Whatever had been there seemed to evaporate the second she entered. Cassie backed out and returned to bed, but sleep refused to come. Weeks passed, and the phenomena escalated. The footsteps became a nightly ritual, always following the same path and halting at the master bedroom. Soon, Cassie started hearing what sounded like dozens of boots marching in formation, stepping with military precision. The sound would start faint, distant, then swell as if the soldiers were right outside her bedroom door, only to vanish abruptly, leaving eerie silence. Then came the unmistakable echo of cannon fire. Distant but undeniable, each boom rolled through the house like thunder. Cassie gripped her sheets as the blasts repeated, shaking the window panes. Between the thunderous echoes, she could hear shouting, officers barking orders, and the sharp crack of rifles. The battle seemed to unfold right outside. But when she peered through the windows, all she saw was the quiet street and neighboring houses shrouded in darkness. Determined to understand, Cassie dove into research. Hours at the local library and historical society revealed the house's grim past. It had once been a field hospital during the Battle of Gettysburg. In July 1863, thousands of injured soldiers had been treated in homes and barns like hers. Improvised surgeries, amputations without anesthesia or proper sanitation. Many soldiers had perished from their wounds or infection. Mass graves had once dotted the area, later moved to the National Cemetery. Armed with this knowledge, Cassie felt a strange mix of horror and empathy. She shuddered at the suffering that had occurred in the very walls she now lived in. But she also mourned for the soldiers trapped in their final moments. Gradually, she began to interpret the strange nightly sounds not as threats, but as echoes of unimaginable pain, replaying endlessly like a recording that refused to stop. Yet understanding the source didn't make it easier to live with. Shadows began appearing along the hallways and stairs, always at the periphery of her vision. Figures in uniform, rifles in hand, flickered in and out of sight. One night, she woke to a shadowy silhouette at the foot of her bed, silent, perfectly still. Paralyzed with terror, she watched as it dissolved into darkness. The most harrowing incident came on a sweltering July night, almost 162 years to the day since the battle. The air in her bedroom was thick and oppressive, and a scream ripped through the house, a raw, agonized sound of someone enduring unbearable pain. Shining her phone's flashlight, she forced herself up the stairs. The wailing grew louder, joined by frantic voices and metallic clatters. In the master bedroom, she glimpsed the past. A crude wooden table, a young man writhing in agony, a bloody, twisted leg. Men in blood-stained aprons hovered around him, one holding a saw, ready to amputate. The vision lasted only a second before vanishing. The room reverted to its empty state, bathed in moonlight. Cassie stumbled back, her hand pressed to her mouth, struggling to hold herself together. She hadn't just heard history. She'd seen it unfold before her eyes. The rest of the night found her parked in the driveway, unable to return indoors. The next day, she called a local priest, hoping for some sense of relief. Though not particularly religious, she felt compelled to do something, anything, to ease the unrest in the house. The priest arrived with holy water, a Bible, and items for the blessing. Room by room, he sprinkled water and offered prayers. When the blessing concluded, he spoke gently but firmly. Some places hold the weight of the past in ways that never fully fade. The suffering etched into the home left an imprint, and while the blessing might help bring some peace, it could not erase what had occurred. He advised Cassie to treat the spirits with respect and remember, they weren't there to harm her, merely trapped in the echoes of their final moments. For a few weeks, the house remained quiet. No footsteps, no marching, no cannon fire. Cassie finally allowed herself to breathe and begin enjoying the restored home she had poured so much effort into. But eventually, the sounds returned, quieter, subtler. She made a choice. She couldn't abandon the house. Instead, she would coexist, speaking aloud to the spirits, placing flowers in the master bedroom as a memorial, acknowledging their presence. These rituals seemed to calm them. The echoes lessened in intensity. Footsteps and shadows still appeared occasionally, but they no longer stirred fear. They were part of the house's story, and she had learned to live alongside them. Over time, Cassie noticed that the house seemed to respond to her acknowledgement of its past. The footsteps no longer pounded relentlessly. The shadowy figures slowed their restless pacing, and the distant cannon fire became occasional rumbles that she could almost ignore. She still saw fleeting silhouettes at the edges of her vision, but the terror had lifted, replaced by a melancholy awareness. These were not ghosts out to harm her. They were echoes, remnants of lives that had ended in chaos and pain, replaying the moments of their last hours. Cassie began to incorporate their presence into her daily life. When she cleaned, she would whisper a small greeting to the soldiers she saw out of the corner of her eye. She left water and flowers on windowsills, especially in the master bedroom where the surgical table had appeared to her. She spoke aloud in moments of quiet. "I see you. I hear you. You're remembered." Slowly, the house became less a source of dread and more a living memory of history, a tangible connection to events that had shaped the land for over a century. Friends and family who visited sometimes sensed the atmosphere. One cousin had commented, "It's like this place is alive, like it's breathing history." Cassie never tried to explain the phenomena outright, unless pressed. Most people weren't ready to believe in something they couldn't touch or rationalize. But for those willing to listen, she shared the story of the soldiers, the field hospital, and the house's unique resonance with the past. Cassie also began documenting everything herself. She kept a journal of sounds, sightings, and strange occurrences, just as the house's history dictated. She made sketches of the hallway shadows, wrote down the dates of cannon booms, and recorded the subtle changes she noticed over weeks and months. It became a kind of partnership. She acknowledged the spirits, and they seemed to acknowledge her presence in return. The house no longer felt oppressive. It felt watched, like a museum curated by unseen caretakers. One July night, Nearly 2 years after moving in, Cassie had an experience that would cement her understanding of the house. The heat was heavy, and the summer air smelled of wet earth and wildflowers. She lay in bed, drowsy, when she heard the familiar cadence of marching boots. But this time, the sound didn't stop. It circled the hallway, down the stairs, and out to the front door, as if the soldiers were performing a full inspection. Heart racing, she whispered, "I see you. I remember you." In that instant, the footsteps slowed and faded, replaced by a soft, almost musical murmur of voices. Words emerged, faint and broken, snippets of orders, names, and acknowledgments. Cassie realized they weren't trying to scare her. They were recounting, reliving, trying to make sure someone remembered. That night, she slept lightly, comforted by the understanding that these echoes were fragments of history seeking recognition rather than revenge. The house's lessons extended beyond the supernatural. Cassie became fascinated by the stories of the soldiers themselves. She researched individual names, traced service records, and pieced together personal accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg and its aftermath. Each fragment of history deepened her connection to the place, and she began to see her role not just as a resident, but as a steward of memory. The house had chosen her to bear witness, to honor the lives that had been lived and lost within its walls. Visitors sometimes caught glimpses of the echoes. A friend, staying the night, swore he saw a soldier pacing silently outside the master bedroom door, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the floorboards as if inspecting them. Another guest felt a chill while walking past the staircase, claiming they could hear muffled shouting and the scrape of a saw. Cassie listened to their stories, nodding knowingly, careful not to frighten them, but also confident that the house had revealed a small piece of its truth to them, too. As the years passed, Cassie adapted further. She decorated the house in a way that respected its past, while making it comfortable for modern living. She left some rooms untouched, keeping the original floors, moldings, and stonework intact, knowing that the echoes favored authenticity. She renovated only when necessary, carefully preserving anything that might hold significance for the restless spirits. The house had taught her patience, respect, and the weight of memory, and she honored it in every decision she made. On certain nights, particularly in July, when the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg drew near, the sounds returned with more intensity. Boots marched, voices murmured, cannons boomed faintly. Cassie would lie awake, listening, sometimes tracing her fingers along the bedspread, whispering thanks to the soldiers she could not see clearly. Occasionally, she glimpsed full figures in the hallway, uniformed men frozen mid-step, rifles slung over shoulders. She no longer flinched. Instead, she felt a profound connection to the past, a reminder of the sacrifices that had occurred here. The most remarkable moment came one evening when a storm rolled in, thunder booming across the fields. Cassie was alone, the house lit only by a few lamps. She heard the familiar sounds of a surgical procedure, the faint moan of a soldier in pain. This time, however, she saw something new. A figure kneeling beside the table, guiding the hands of the men performing the amputations, as if easing their actions, reducing suffering in that terrible moment. The vision lasted only seconds before vanishing, but it left Cassie with a deep sense of peace. Somehow, the house had healed not just her perception, but the echoes themselves, giving them a chance at closure, however small. Cassie never left the house. She could have sold it, but she knew no one else would treat it with the respect required. The history here was too vivid, too alive. To abandon it would be to betray the voices that had shaped her life, as well as the lives of countless men who had come before. Instead, she chose to live with the echoes, acknowledging them, caring for them, and learning from them. Neighbors sometimes sensed her quiet presence in the house, remarking that she seemed to understand it in a way others never could. She didn't try to explain. She just nodded, letting the house and its history speak for themselves. Visitors who were open to it were invited to learn, to reflect, and to remember. Those who weren't simply left with the beauty of the architecture and the charm of a well-kept home, never realizing the layers of time they walked alongside. To this day, Cassie Harper lives in the house. She has completed most renovations, creating a warm, inviting home while maintaining the integrity of the original structure. On certain July nights, the faint rhythm of marching boots and distant cannon fire still echoes through the halls. Shadows linger in corners, and voices whisper from the walls. But Cassie no longer feels fear. She has learned to coexist with the past, to honor it, and to remember that old houses don't just hold memories. They hold the lives that were lived, the moments of suffering and courage, and the echoes that refuse to remain silent. Story 5. Jace Rowan had always been obsessed with abandoned places, the stories tucked away in buildings that the world had left behind. He was part of a small crew of urban explorers who spent weekends documenting forgotten corners of Pennsylvania, snapping pictures of decay and digging into the histories of these forgotten structures. Most of their haunts were old mills, shuttered schools, or crumbling homes, places heavy with melancholy but rarely threatening. That all changed the day they set their sights on the old Riverside Psychiatric Asylum. The asylum sat on the edge of a dying mill town in western Pennsylvania, a sprawling red brick complex fenced in with rusted chain link that had been breached so many times it was basically a welcome mat. The hospital had shut down in 1994 after years of dwindling funding and whispers of patient abuse. Since then, vandals, thrill-seekers, and curious locals had turned it into a local legend. Jace had wanted to explore it for years, but was always scared off by the cops who patrolled the area. But on a dull, gray October Saturday, Jace and 3 friends decided to take the plunge. They parked a half-mile away and slipped along the tree line until they reached a section of fence ripped wide open. The property sprawled before them, buildings connected by covered walkways and underground tunnels. They aimed for the main building first, a 4-story relic that once held offices and patient wards. The front door was boarded up, but a side entry had been forced open, the lock long gone, splintered wood surrounding it. Jace led the way, flashlight and camera ready. Inside, the place was chaos. Graffiti-splashed walls, shattered glass littering the floor, and a rank odor of mildew and rot. They moved cautiously through the first floor, documenting empty offices and treatment rooms, finding little more than broken furniture and toppled file cabinets. But when they hit the basement, the vibe shifted. The stairwell was cramped and dark, the walls slick with moisture. At the bottom, a long corridor stretched out, flanked by heavy steel doors with wire mesh windows, each one padlocked, or at least remnants of padlocks remained. Jace's chest tightened. Psychiatric hospitals didn't usually have prison-style cells. This was different. One by one, they cracked the doors, sweeping flashlights through each cell. Most were empty, concrete floors, bare walls, but some held remnants that made them flinch. One room had metal restraints bolted to the walls, leather straps with rusted buckles. Another contained a skeletal bed frame outfitted with more restraints. Jace's hands trembled as he snapped pictures. He'd read about abusive practices in old mental hospitals, but seeing the evidence firsthand was another matter entirely. Then they hit the last door in the hallway. Unlike the others, the metal was relatively intact, the deadbolt still engaged. Marcus, one of Jace's friends, pulled a crowbar from his backpack and pried it open. The door groaned on its hinges, revealing a space that froze all of them. This room was different, larger, with an examination table against one wall, stirrups stained and rusted. A nearby cart held surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, and other tools that looked as if they belonged in an operating theater. The corners were littered with yellowed patient files, some warped by water. Jace picked up one and started reading. It detailed a woman admitted in 1978 for severe depression. The notes were clinical, detached, cataloging electroshock treatments, experimental medications, and something called special procedures. The file ended grimly. She'd died during treatment. Flipping through more files, they discovered a pattern. Patients subjected to unethical, sometimes deadly experiments, with little to no consent. Some cases stretched to the early 1990s, just before the facility closed. Jace felt a pit in his stomach. This wasn't distant history. This was recent, grotesquely real. Marcus's voice broke through their shock. Behind a stack of old mattresses, he'd found a hidden door leading to another corridor. The group hesitated, debating whether to leave or investigate further. But obligation and curiosity won. The passage was narrow, lined with smaller cells, each one more horrifying than the last. Some were sensory deprivation rooms, bare, windowless, concrete walls scarred with scratches and what looked like dried blood. Others had padded walls ripped open, chains dangling from ceilings, all meant to break or control patients. At the corridor's end was an operating room unlike any they'd seen. The table had restraints on every limb, shelves held mysterious jars and liquids, and a large one-way mirror spied on the room. A small hidden door revealed an observation room with notebooks detailing decades of experiments, procedures, reactions, doses, and outcomes. Many ended with the same cold notation: subject expired. The most recent entry, dated just 3 months ago, noted the facility as inactive but maintained, materials ready for future use. Jace froze. Someone had been here recently. They snapped every photo they could, documenting instruments, files, and rooms. Then they retraced their steps to the main floor, hearts hammering. But as they reached the side exit, Jace froze. A door somewhere in the building clicked closed, followed by deliberate footsteps. Someone else was inside. Without hesitation, they bolted, racing across the property toward the fence. Jace glanced back and caught a silhouette in an upper window. A dark shape framed by broken glass, watching them. Panic fueled their sprint until they finally reached the car, where they sat in stunned silence, trying to digest what they'd seen. Back in town, Jace reported everything to the police, handing over photographs, describing the basement, the files, and the hidden corridor. State investigators and forensic teams quickly moved in, cordoning off the area. What they found confirmed every detail. Decades of illegal experimentation and abuse, files documenting hundreds of cases, and several bodies buried on the grounds. And forensic analysis confirmed that someone had been there recently, maintaining the space, keeping it ready. Despite the thorough investigation, no arrests were made. The original doctors were either dead or impossible to identify, and whoever had maintained the facility left no traces, no fingerprints, no DNA, no leads. The asylum was permanently sealed, entrances bricked up, and the grounds secured with heavy fencing. But Jace couldn't shake the memory of the figure in the window. Was it a surviving perpetrator? Someone new? He couldn't tell. And the thought of other hidden places, abandoned yet still active, haunted him. How many more horrors lay hidden, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to stumble across them? Even now, years later, the shadow of that day lingers. He sometimes wakes up thinking of the narrow basement corridor, the sensory deprivation cells, the jars of unknown chemicals, and the last ominous note: materials secured for future use. The memory is a quiet, gnawing reminder that some buildings hold not just history, but active, unspeakable darkness. Story 6. Kenzie Monroe had never been one to get spooked easily. She'd house-sat for friends and relatives countless times, always comfortable spending nights alone in strange homes. So when her mom's friend, a woman named Mrs. Carlyle, asked her to stay at her farmhouse in rural Lancaster County for 2 weeks while she visited her daughter in Ohio, Kenzie didn't hesitate. The offer was too good to pass up. The pay was solid, the duties minimal, just feed the cats, water the plants, and she'd get uninterrupted time to work on her grad school thesis. The farmhouse was a classic 2-story, with crisp white clapboards and a wraparound porch, sitting at the end of a long gravel drive, surrounded by fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, which suited Kenzie perfectly. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon, and Mrs. Carlyle spent nearly an hour showing her around. She pointed out everything Kenzie would need and introduced her to the 2 cats, both of which seemed more interested in napping than acknowledging a new human. The first few days passed without incident. Kenzie settled into a routine: early mornings with coffee, hours spent typing on her laptop, and long afternoon walks through the fields. The farmhouse had a calm, lived-in vibe, the kind of silence that feels natural in a home that's been loved for generations. But on the 4th night, something small made her pause. She was sitting at the kitchen table, working on her laptop, when she noticed that one of the dining chairs had been shifted slightly, pulled out as if someone had sat in it and forgotten to push it back. Kenzie froze, trying to remember if she'd moved it. She was sure she hadn't. She hadn't even been in the dining room since breakfast. She pushed the chair back and returned to her work, telling herself she must have done it absent-mindedly. But a tight knot of unease settled in her chest. The next morning, she discovered another anomaly. The bathroom door, which she always left open, was closed. Again, she reasoned it must have swung shut on its own, or maybe a cat brushed against it. But the door was heavy, not easily moved, and everything inside the bathroom looked untouched. Kenzie told herself she was imagining things, that too much time alone was making her paranoid. But the odd occurrences kept happening. Books that had been neatly lined on shelves were slightly rearranged. A cup she was certain she'd put in the dishwasher appeared on the counter. A basement light she'd turned off flickered on. Nothing dramatic, but each small shift chipped away at her sense of calm. By the 7th night, the tension reached a breaking point. Kenzie woke at 3 a.m. to soft, deliberate footsteps outside her bedroom. She lay frozen, heart hammering, listening. The sound moved along the hallway, pausing at the top of the stairs. She held her breath, but after a tense moment, the hall fell silent. Gripping her phone, she cautiously opened her door and shined the flashlight down the hall. Empty. Both cats were curled up on the couch below, alone as far as she could see. The next morning, muddy footprints appeared in the kitchen. Small prints, smaller than hers, running from the back door to the basement stairs. Fear hit her like a cold wave. She had locked the back door before bed, part of her nightly routine. Yet here were footprints leading inside. Kenzie followed them, stopping at the top of the basement stairs. The basement had bothered her from day one. Unfinished, with exposed beams, patches of dirt floor, and that musty smell of old earth and mildew. The single bare bulb did little to illuminate the space. But the footprints led downward, and she knew she had to see where they ended. Slowly, she descended, hand gripping the railing, eyes adjusting to dim light. At the bottom, the footprints continued across the concrete and vanished into a darker corner. She flicked on her phone's flashlight. What she saw made her stomach twist. A crawl space, a narrow opening in the foundation, extended beneath the house. The footprints led straight to it. Crouching, she peered inside. It was low, barely 3 feet high, stretching into shadow. Dirt was scuffed with more footprints, and she saw a crumpled, grimy blanket, a backpack, and a small pile of food wrappers and empty water bottles. Someone had been living here. Someone had been slipping out at night, moving around the house while she slept. Her hands trembled as she backed away, heart racing. She needed out, now. She bolted for the basement stairs, but a sound froze her in place. Rustling in the crawl space, fabric scraping against dirt. Someone was there, and they knew she had found them. Without hesitation, she snatched her keys and phone, sprinted out the front door, and drove straight to the nearest gas station, shaking so hard she could barely hold the wheel. She called the police, voice trembling as she recounted what she'd seen. Within 20 minutes, 2 officers arrived and followed her back. Kenzie waited in the car as they moved cautiously through the farmhouse, weapons ready. After what felt like forever, one officer emerged, motioning for her to come over. His face was grim. The officers had confirmed long-term habitation in the crawl space. In addition to the blanket and backpack, they discovered canned food, bottled water, a change of clothes, and a notebook filled with handwritten entries. The officer wouldn't let Kenzie read it, but explained the entries meticulously tracked her daily life. When she woke, what she ate, the times she went on walks, even when she went to bed. Someone had been observing her every move, hiding beneath the floorboards, recording her life like a scientific experiment. Yet the intruder was gone. The police searched the farmhouse and surrounding fields, but found no sign of anyone. The back door hadn't been forced, no broken windows, no other points of entry. Except the crawl space, which had an exterior panel hidden behind overgrown shrubs. It wasn't locked, and it showed clear signs of repeated use. The officers documented everything, took photos, collected evidence, and filed a report. But they admitted finding the perpetrator would be unlikely. There were no fingerprints on any of the items, and the notebook revealed no identifying details. The handwriting was meticulous, almost clinical, indicating careful planning. This wasn't some random trespasser. This was someone methodical, deliberate, and fixated on her. Kenzie immediately called Mrs. Carlyle, who was horrified and insisted she leave the farmhouse at once. Kenzie packed her things that same day, refusing to stay another night. Though the crawl space was sealed and a security system installed, the intruder remained at large. For months afterward, Kenzie couldn't sleep in unfamiliar places without checking every closet, every door, every nook and cranny. Every creak of a floorboard or shadow in her apartment sent her heart racing. She started therapy, trying to process the trauma, but the anxiety lingered. Even years later, she felt a primal unease whenever she was alone somewhere new. In the back of her mind, she knew the person who had invaded the farmhouse might still be out there, watching someone else. The notebook remained in police custody, a chilling record of obsession and patience. Kenzie carried the knowledge with her every day. Privacy is fragile. Safety is never guaranteed. And sometimes, the most terrifying threats are the ones lurking just beyond our perception, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. Story 7. Logan Hayes had always been hooked on local lore. The kind of stories that never made it into textbooks, but lingered in old newspapers and the memories of longtime residents. A grad student studying Appalachian folklore at a small college in northeastern Pennsylvania, his thesis focused on oral traditions and unexplained events across the Pocono Mountains. It was during that research that he stumbled onto something that would haunt him for years. A disturbing pattern of disappearances along a single hiking trail that spanned over 80 years. The trail, known as High Ridge Loop, was a moderately challenging 5-mile loop cutting through dense woods and jagged cliffs, offering breathtaking views of the valley below. popular with both locals and tourists, especially during October, when the fall leaves lit the forest in fiery reds and golds. It seemed perfectly safe. Logan had hiked it himself several times without incident. But as he dug through microfilm and archival newspapers at the County Historical Society, a creeping unease settled in his chest. The earliest recorded disappearance dated back to 1942. A 23-year-old named Samuel Price had gone hiking on a crisp October afternoon and never returned. His car was still parked at the trailhead, jacket tossed on the back seat, but no sign of him existed anywhere along the trail. Search parties scoured the forest for weeks, bringing dogs and volunteers from neighboring towns, but found nothing. Not a trace, not a scrap, not a clue. Eventually, the case was labeled missing and quietly faded from public memory. The next case appeared in 1958. A woman named Ruth Hollingsworth, 35, had been hiking with her husband when she paused to snap a photo. Her husband continued on for a few steps and turned back to call her. But Ruth was gone. Her camera was found lying on the trail where she had stood, but Ruth herself had vanished. Searches turned up nothing, and the mystery went unsolved. As Logan continued digging, the list grew. In 1973, a teenage boy disappeared while hiking with his scout troop. In 1989, a seasoned hiker in his 50s vanished mid-loop. In 2001, a young couple vanished together, leaving their car untouched at the trailhead. Most recently, in 2019, a woman in her early 40s disappeared on a morning walk. Her phone was found powered on, lying on the trail with no explanation. Meticulously, Logan compiled every report, cross-referencing newspapers, police files, and interviews with relatives. 11 confirmed disappearances emerged between 1942 and 2019. But patterns surfaced that made his stomach knot. Every case had occurred in October, most between the 10th and 20th. All victims were alone when they vanished, even if they had started with others. Physical evidence, when present, clustered around a specific spot, roughly 2 miles in, where the trail curved around a rocky ledge locals called Falcon's Edge. Logan turned to the oldest residents he could find, those who had lived in the area for decades and might remember details left out of official reports. Weeks were spent driving to small towns and nursing homes, listening to stories in cluttered living rooms brimming with photographs and mementos. Most could recall at least one disappearance, though details were fuzzy. One account chilled him more than any other. Eleanor Marsh, 92, had grown up in the region. She remembered when High Ridge Loop was first laid out in the late 1930s. Before the trail existed, the land had been sacred to the Lupi people, a Native American tribe who had inhabited the region long before European settlers arrived. Eleanor explained that Falcon's Edge had been a burial ground, and constructing the trail had disturbed it. Her grandmother had warned everyone not to hike that path in October, when the spirits were most active, the veil between the living and the dead thinnest. Eleanor hesitated before revealing a few disappearances that were never officially documented. A little girl lost in the early 1950s vanished while hiking with her family, and 2 cases in the 1960s involving transient hikers, forgotten because no one reported them missing. With this new intel, Logan went back to his research, scouring records for any additional incidents. He uncovered at least 3 more cases, all in October, all along High Ridge Loop. The confirmed total rose to 14, and he suspected there were more long forgotten. Determined to confront the trail himself, Logan chose October 15th, the date most disappearances had occurred. He came equipped with a GPS, camera, and a detailed map, leaving word with friends about where he would be and when he planned to return. The morning was gray and misty, cool enough to make the forest feel alive with whispers. Logan began his hike at a steady pace, pausing to photograph landmarks and jot notes. The trail was unnervingly quiet. No other hikers appeared, a strange rarity for a weekend in peak foliage season. Every sound, his footsteps, the wind through the leaves, felt magnified. When he reached Falcon's Edge, Logan felt a shift in the air. The atmosphere grew heavy, chilling his bones. He felt slightly disoriented, as if he had stepped into a realm slightly out of sync with reality. Standing on the ledge, gazing over the valley, he tried to imagine what the missing had experienced. Did they feel this same disorientation? Did they see something that drew them off the path? He raised his camera to photograph the ridge and surrounding forest. As he adjusted the settings, a sound froze him in place. A voice, faint and distant, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. It seemed to drift from deeper in the forest. Logan's heart raced. He listened, tense and motionless, uncertain if it was real or imagination. The voice called again, clearer this time, and an almost irresistible urge tugged him toward it. Logan took a step, then another, almost on autopilot. But then, a cold rush of terror made him pause. The stories Eleanor had shared, the warnings, the 14 vanished hikers, all who may have heard the same voice, flashed in his mind. He stepped back, shivering, and turned away from Falcon's Edge, heading back down the trail, moving with urgency. The voice seemed to follow, faint but persistent, until eventually it vanished into the fog. Logan didn't stop until he reached the trailhead, breath ragged, hands shaking, glancing nervously at the tree line as if something might emerge. Back at his apartment, Logan pored over the photos he had taken. Most were mundane, trees, rocks, and trail paths, but one from Falcon's Edge made his stomach drop. Hidden among the misty trees was a figure. Tall, indistinct, more shadow than substance, yet unmistakably humanoid. Its gaze seemed fixed on him. He showed the image to colleagues and professors, but explanations ranged from light trickery to a fellow hiker hidden by fog. Logan knew better. He had been alone, and the figure was deep in a dense, nearly impassable section of forest. It was not human. Logan assembled a comprehensive report. The 14 disappearances, the patterns, and the history of the burial site. He sent copies to academic journals, the State Park Service, and local law enforcement. The responses varied. Some dismissed it as coincidence or folklore. Others took it seriously enough to post warning signs along the trail, particularly near Falcon's Edge. 6 months later, the pattern continued. A 50-year-old man disappeared on October 12th while hiking High Ridge Loop. His car remained at the trailhead. A search was conducted, but no trace of him emerged. The disappearance fit the historic pattern perfectly. Logan felt a mix of frustration and helplessness. He had tried to warn people, had documented everything meticulously, yet hikers still vanished. High Ridge Loop remained open to the public. Signs were ignored, dismissed as superstition by thrill seekers and tourists. But Logan knew the truth. He would never return to that trail, particularly not in October. And he wondered, how many more people would vanish before authorities acknowledged the danger? Before they admitted some places were never meant to be walked upon, that certain boundaries should remain untouched. Even now, the shadow of Falcon's Edge lingered in his mind, a constant reminder that some mysteries and some entities were far beyond understanding, waiting quietly in the trees for the next soul to wander too close. Story 8. Jade Larkin had never really cared much about her family tree. She was a city girl through and through, born and raised in Philadelphia, and the Pennsylvania Dutch backroads where her great-grandmother had lived felt like another world entirely. But when she unexpectedly inherited a small sum from a distant relative, she decided to spend it chasing her ancestry. That meant driving down twisting country roads into Lancaster County, winding toward a tiny dot on the map where her family's roots still ran deep. Her grandmother had arranged for her to stay with some distant cousins she'd never met, an elderly couple named Henry and Martha. They'd agreed to host her for a week while she explored the area and dug into her family's past. Their home was a traditional farmhouse, plain but sturdy, with a history that seemed to seep from the wooden walls and weathered floors. Henry and Martha were polite, curious, and a little wary, giving her measured smiles and watching her with an alertness that felt almost like caution. The community itself was like stepping into a different era. Many homes had no modern updates, and locals spoke in a thick German dialect that Jade struggled to follow. On her second night, while sitting at the dinner table, Henry said something that made her pause. "Be careful asking too many questions," he warned. "Some stories are better left alone." When she pressed him, Martha quickly changed the topic, but Jade noticed the subtle tension in their eyes. Later that night, after Henry had gone to bed, Martha spoke to Jade in a hushed, serious tone. She told her about an old legend that had survived in the valley for generations, a tale of a curse that couldn't be destroyed, only transferred. According to Martha, it had begun in the early 1800s with a woman named Amelia Weiss, accused of witchcraft by her neighbors. Amelia had been a healer, using herbs and remedies to treat the sick, but fear and superstition twisted the perception of her skills. The villagers turned against her. She was forced to live alone in the woods, away from the homes she once helped. Before she vanished entirely, Amelia placed a curse on the family that had accused her, the Kaufman clan. The hex was cruel and specific. In every generation, at least one member of the family would face illness, tragedy, or death. The only way to break it was to pass it on, transferring the burden to someone who showed curiosity about the story or dug too deep into the history. Jade listened with a mix of fascination and skepticism. She asked Martha if she believed the story was real. Martha's expression darkened. "I've seen things you wouldn't believe," she said quietly. "People who got too curious, who asked the wrong questions. They ended up facing things they couldn't explain. Tragedies, misfortunes. It's real." She warned Jade not to dig further, not to seek out the details, because curiosity itself could make someone a target. But Jade couldn't resist. The next day, while Henry and Martha worked the fields, she drove into the nearest town and visited the local historical society. She pored over old records, looking for anything on Amelia Weiss or the Kaufmans. What she found unsettled her. There were detailed accounts of Amelia's trial from 1823, describing her accusation of witchcraft and the strange misfortunes that befell her accusers. Objects moving without explanation, animals dying mysteriously, children falling ill for no reason. Amelia was banished, yet the record also documented repeated tragedies striking the Kaufman family over generations. Illnesses, accidents, and early deaths. Almost every generation had someone struck down. Even more chilling, Jade discovered a minister's journal from 1847. It described a woman who had asked too many questions about the Kaufman's misfortunes. A Kaufman allegedly came to her home and spoke certain words, transferring the curse. The minister noted that the woman tried to get rid of the hex through the church, but died 6 months later in a mysterious house fire. Reading the entry, Jade felt a cold wave wash over her chest. She had asked questions. She had dug too deep. Could she have already invited the curse into her own life? Returning to the farmhouse that evening, Jade felt Martha's eyes on her. She led her to the living room, voice quiet but urgent. "You made a mistake," she said. By seeking out the story, you've exposed yourself. Someone from the valley will likely come soon, looking to transfer the hex to a new host. And that host could be you. Panic knotted Jade's stomach. She asked what she could do, how she could protect herself. Martha shook her head solemnly. Old rituals existed, cleansing ceremonies that might shield someone. But once a curse attached itself, breaking it was nearly impossible. Jade had little choice but to attempt the ritual and hope it worked. That night, Martha took her to see Hannah, a woman in her 90s who was said to know the old ways. Hannah's small cottage sat at the edge of farmland, surrounded by herb gardens and wildflowers. She listened silently as Jade recounted everything, eyes sharp, analyzing every detail. When Jade finished, Hannah nodded slowly, warning that the ritual offered no guarantees. They prepared it just after sunset, in a clearing behind the cottage. A small fire burned in the center, and Hannah instructed Jade to speak aloud everything she knew about the hex, naming the people and tragedies to acknowledge the curse fully. Then Hannah tossed dried herbs into the flames, muttering incantations in the old German dialect, words Jade couldn't understand. Smoke filled the air, acrid and dense, burning her eyes as it curled into the night sky. Hannah explained that the ritual was meant to sever the curse's hold, to make Jade invisible to it, to close the door she had accidentally opened. She stressed that Jade must never speak of the hex again, mentioning it could pass it on to someone else. Exhausted but desperate, Jade agreed, praying the ritual worked. Jade left the valley the next morning, driving back to Philadelphia with a mix of relief and lingering dread. For weeks, life seemed normal. She returned to her job, hung out with friends, and tried to push the experience out of her mind. But then, the small disturbances began. At first, they were minor. Objects she'd left in one place would appear somewhere else. Lights flickered as she entered rooms, and there was a nagging sensation of being watched. Then came the nightmares, vivid dreams where she was back in the woods, surrounded by whispering figures speaking in a language she couldn't understand. One night, she woke to find a gaunt, elderly man standing at the foot of her bed. His clothing was old-fashioned, his face pale and hollow. He spoke in the German dialect, words Jade didn't fully understand, but the message was clear. She had a choice. She could either carry the hex herself or transfer it to another. She screamed, and the figure disappeared, but the warning lingered. In the months that followed, misfortune struck with an unsettling precision. She lost her job after a string of inexplicable events, got into a car crash that totaled her vehicle, and experienced health problems doctors couldn't explain. Stress and coincidence seemed insufficient to account for the pattern. Desperate, Jade reached out to Martha, asking if anything else could be done. Martha admitted the ritual had failed to fully protect her. The curse had latched on, and the only escape was to pass it to another. An impossible, morally devastating choice. Jade now lived under constant pressure. Every conversation, every question about her past or her ancestry felt dangerous. She kept her curiosity in check, knowing the curse thrived on inquisitiveness. Each day, the weight of the hex pressed on her chest, a shadow she could never shake. She avoided talking about the valley, avoided sharing her story, and remained hyper-aware of anyone asking questions about her family. When someone showed too much curiosity, Jade felt the words rising in her throat, a terrible temptation to speak and be free, but she resisted. Even years later, the memory of Hannah's smoke-filled clearing and the chilling minister's journal stayed with her. Jade rebuilt some semblance of normal life, but she knew the hex lingered, a subtle, suffocating presence in her world. She could not ignore it, could not forget the terrible choice she faced: carry the curse herself or pass it on to another innocent. To this day, Jade lives under the shadow of what she unearthed. She carefully monitors her speech, her curiosity, her actions. She hopes someday to find a solution, a way to break the cycle that has haunted her family for nearly 2 centuries. But until then, she walks cautiously. Every strange sound, every misfortune a reminder that some stories, once heard, can never truly be forgotten. Story 9. Eli Turner had taken the night security gig at the old ironclad steel plant out of sheer desperation. He'd been unemployed for half a year, his savings nearly drained, and the pay at the mill was better than any other offer he'd gotten. The fact that it was a graveyard shift at a long-abandoned industrial site in a fading Pennsylvania town was something he tried not to think about. He needed the money. The job sounded simple enough on paper. Patrol the property every 2 hours, check for intruders or vandals, and fill out a report at the end of the shift. The hiring manager had warned him up front. Most guards quit within a few weeks, but Eli assumed it was just boredom or isolation that drove people off. He had no idea how off base he was. Ironclad had shut down in 2003 after more than 100 years in operation. Back in its heyday, it had employed thousands of men who labored in brutal conditions to produce steel for railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers. But like so many Rust Belt towns, once the mill closed, the town crumbled. Businesses folded, homes were abandoned, and the sprawling complex decayed into rusting steel and crumbling brick. A development company now owned the property, planning to eventually bulldoze it and build something new. For the time being, they just needed someone to keep watch, to make sure no one turned it into a hangout for thieves or squatters. Eli's first shift was on a Wednesday in late September. The sun was dipping behind the horizon when he parked in front of the main gate, long shadows stretching across broken windows and peeling paint. The main building was massive, a labyrinth of brick, steel, and conveyor belts that seemed to stretch endlessly. Broken panes stared down like vacant eyes, and the air reeked of rust, oil, and old sweat. He met briefly with the day supervisor, a grizzled man named Roy, who handed him a flashlight, keys, and a clipboard with a patrol route sketched out. Roy didn't say much, just muttered a "good luck" that sounded half sarcastic, half warning, as if he doubted Eli would last the night. The first few hours were quiet. Eli wandered through echoing hallways, pointing his flashlight into corners where shadows clung like cobwebs, scribbling notes on his clipboard. The silence was oppressive. Every step on the metal catwalks rang out like a gunshot, and the wind whistling through broken windows added a mournful moan that set his nerves on edge. Nothing moved, nothing spoke, just the weight of decay pressing in from every angle. Around midnight, Eli first noticed the sounds. He was on the main factory floor, a cavernous space filled with rusted machinery and empty conveyor lines, when he heard it. A low, mechanical hum, rhythmic and persistent, like motors spinning and belts turning. He froze. The power had been shut off years ago. Nothing should have been running. He followed the sound, flashlight slicing through darkness. The hum grew louder, more precise. Clangs of metal, hiss of steam, grinding gears, like the plant had suddenly sprung to life. But as he approached the source, the noises gradually faded, until all that remained was silence. Eli's pulse raced. He told himself it was the acoustics, the wind, the way sound bounced in a cavernous building. Yet something inside whispered that wasn't all there was. Then came the voices. Men shouting to one another, calling out over the din of machines. Faint, muffled, but unmistakably human. Eli's stomach turned. He was supposed to be alone. He called out, identifying himself as security, but no one answered. The voices rose and fell, sometimes sharp enough to make out snatches of words, other times barely audible, teasing his mind with the impossible. He retreated to the security office near the front gate. The old surveillance system was functional, but the feeds showed nothing. Empty halls, dark factory floors, and broken machinery. Rational explanations nagged at him. Large steel spaces carried sound weirdly. Echoes could create illusions. But his gut told him otherwise. Something was here. Something that didn't belong to the present. The next night, it got worse. The hum returned, stronger, and with it came smells of hot metal and coal smoke, odors that shouldn't exist in a dead building. Shadows darted in the corners of his eyes, human-like figures vanishing the instant he turned his flashlight toward them. And then, in an old furnace section, he saw a man. The figure wore canvas work clothes, thick boots, and a soot-streaked jacket. He moved slowly, inspecting machinery with careful hands, as though checking for flaws. Eli called out, but the man didn't respond. He was methodical, deliberate, almost alive. Eli edged closer. The man finally turned, and their eyes met for a split second. Exhausted, weathered, smudged with sweat and grime. Then the man evaporated, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Eli stumbled back, hands shaking as he locked the office door behind him. Rationality offered nothing. He had seen a ghost, a worker from decades past, replaying his final labor. Eli considered quitting immediately, but knew he couldn't. The money was too necessary. He finished his shift, planning to speak with Roy in the morning. When he did, Roy's reaction confirmed his fears. Every guard who had worked Ironclad had reported strange occurrences. Machinery noises, shadowy figures, full apparitions. They were all common. Roy admitted the company didn't publicize it, fearing they'd never staff the mill otherwise. He assured Eli that the spirits weren't harmful, just stuck in the routines of their former lives. Eli asked about specific incidents. Roy pulled a folder from his desk, a newspaper clipping from 1987. A catastrophic boiler explosion had killed 8 men and injured dozens. The date was September 23rd. Eli froze. His first shift had been September 22nd. He was approaching the anniversary of disaster. That night, dread coiled tight in his stomach. By midnight, the factory roared to life. Sounds of furnaces, clanging steel, the roar of machinery, deafening. The air was hot, thick with sulfur and coal smoke. Drawn forward by some inexplicable compulsion, Eli found himself at the old boiler room, staring at the scene of the 1987 explosion. 8 men stood near the boiler, casual at first, faces turned toward their machines. Solid, tangible, and breathing. For a moment, Eli thought they were trespassers. Then his eyes caught the calendar on the wall. September 23rd, 1987. He was witnessing history. One man reached for a valve. Eli wanted to warn them, scream, intervene, but his body refused. He was frozen, a silent witness. The man turned the valve. Thunderous rumble. The air shook, a deep, bone-jarring vibration. The men shouted, ran, but it was too late. The boiler erupted in fire and light. Eli was thrown back, ears ringing, vision white-hot. When he regained consciousness, he was on the floor of the mill, flashlight still in his hand. Cold, silent air. No men, no explosion. Just the echo of a tragedy replayed. He checked his watch. 12:47 a.m., September 23rd. The spirits had enacted their final moments. Eli quit the next day, refusing to return to a place where the past refused to rest. Roy nodded knowingly. "You'll be fine. Someone else will take the shift. But Eli knew some watchers never left. 6 months later, the mill burned. The fire started in the boiler room and consumed the complex within hours. Authorities labeled it arson, but no suspect emerged. Eli didn't need to read the report. He knew. Ironclad had destroyed itself. Or maybe the spirits had finally taken matters into their own hands. Ashes, twisted metal, a century of history erased. Locals still tell stories. On quiet nights, especially near the anniversary, machinery roars, voices shout, explosions rumble. Echoes of a factory that should no longer exist. Eli hasn't gone back. He never will. Some places, he realized, carry tragedies so deep that even fire cannot erase them. The men of Ironclad may have lost their mill, but not their presence. They remain, trapped in the moments before disaster, eternal laborers of the past.